Salutations. Welcome to or welcome back to Jules's Archive. As I do every month, I'm here with my monthly recap of what I read. So this is everything that I read in January. So starting off with what I finished 2025 with and started the year with, The Strength of the Few by James Islington. This is the second book in the Hierarchy series, which started with The Will of the Many, which is a Roman-inspired fantasy world in which there's hierarchies of power in which people yield their will or basically like their magic kind of life force to the people above them within their like hierarchy and their pyramid. Basically like a pyramid scheme of magic in terms of a society. I love The Will of the Many. It was one of my favorite books of 2024, and The Strength of the Few was one of my most highly anticipated releases of 2025. I think the magic system is so like familiar but unique in terms of kind of this hierarchy of power, which, you know, is reminiscent of ancient and modern power structures in society, but also has kind of this fantastical, mystical element to it. And you find out so much more about the magic in The Strength of the Few. I would say in The Will of the Many, the magic system is definitely part of the story, but in The Strength of the Few, it's very much central to it and central to the mystery as the story continues on past The Will of the Many. I love fantasy books that are political and religious. I don't read fantasy really for like action-packed sequences, but more for the unique dynamics of the society and the magical world building aspect of it. Without giving too much away of the premise of The Strength of the Few, something you find out like really early on in the book is that there's like 3 worlds in this one. The Will of the Many follows one main character, Vis, and it's first person POV, and you follow him throughout the entire like hefty 700-page book. But in The Strength of the Few, you follow Vis again, and it is first person, but there's kind of 3 versions of him, 3 dimensions, which means that the one world that we're used to in The Will of the Many, there's essentially 2 more in The Strength of the Few. This book is one of the most ambitious, kind of broad-reaching book that I have probably ever read, and it was really impressive just for how much it tackled, and in these 3 worlds, intertwining the interactions between the characters and the sequences of action really well between them. But what I struggled with was because we're familiar with one world from The Will of the Many, and then there's 2 more in The Strength of the Few, even though we're following all 3 of these worlds and the progression of their storylines in each world pretty equally in The Strength of the Few, it is hard to be as invested in the new 2 worlds and that version of the character as much as it is in the first ones. Especially since through 700 pages of the first book have built up a familiarity with the cast of characters and the dynamics of the culture and how that magic system works, versus there's no new nuances, new characters, new cultures to get used to in The Strength of the Few. So that was the weakest part of the book, but I think a really unique challenge to kind of read through and get familiar with, and I think that will make me appreciate The Justice of the One, the 3rd book, even more, because I assume there will still be these 3 worlds, but we'll have the basis kind of set for us in The Strength of the Few. I also thought it was so masterfully done how Islington, the author, develops the character Vis in these 3 worlds so differently, because, you know, he's basically developing as a young adult in very still formative years, and he becomes a different person through all 3 of these storylines in these worlds, and he meets new people and this culture that has new values and terminology, and he develops with them. So I really enjoyed by the end of the book seeing how he had grown so differently and how he had assimilated or what he had struggled with, how his personality had developed by nature of his surroundings and the people in his life at that point. And as you go throughout the book, you kind of figure out like what is unraveling. But I also thought it was really enjoyable how different parts of kind of what's going on behind the scenes are revealed at different times throughout each of the storylines. So you kind of learn a little bit more in one storyline earlier than the other, but that makes it really fun and invested to see how kind of the other storyline is going to unravel. So I gave The Strength of the Few 4.5 stars. I'll say this is not really a book to kind of like put down, read a couple chapters, and pick back up. Pretty much the world changes like every 2 or 3 chapters, and the chapters are pretty short, maybe like less than 10 pages at a time. So I found it hard, you know, reading this over the last couple of weeks of the year being at home with a lot going on to just kind of pick up, read a couple of chapters at night. I really kind of wanted to sit down and read a chunk of it and just get through like tens or hundreds of pages at a time if I could, because this is almost 800 pages and it covers so much time. You have to get used to all these new nuances and characters. There's so much going on. So it's worth it, but I would say if you have like a long weekend to really get into this, or you don't have a lot going on a Saturday, I would say sit down and get into this. It's best enjoyed kind of binge reading rather than just microdosing. So that's one thing I'll say about it. I cannot wait for the Justice of One, and I will be picking that up when it's released. Also, something I gotta appreciate is that the hardcover versions of these books came out in this like really cool like geometric Roman inspired design. And the paperbacks came out in this like very much illustrative version where not much is up to the imagination in terms of visualizing what the world looks like. And I really preferred the hardcover version, and that's the book I bought. Honestly, I judged it based on the cover, and I bought it because of the Roman columns. So I love that this version of the book, or the sequel, came out with 2 jacket covers. This is actually the inside of the jacket with the original design language, but then the kind of glossy original cover is more that illustrated version that the paperbacks came out with. So, you know, depending on which copy of the first book you have, the hardcover version of The Strength of the Few can match that. So I appreciate details like that, and it's clear that Islington cared about that for his readers. Also, one thing I'll add is if you're worried about having read, this behemoth of a book, The Will of the Many, a while ago, and it's very complicated and you don't want to reread it before this one, the first kind of chapter of this recaps the main events of the first book really well. There really was no concern for me in terms of remembering what happened in the first book and connecting the pieces, but it is important that happens because it gets into the events of this book so quickly. Yeah, you have to start getting used to the new set of world building pretty quickly in The Strength of the Few. I gave that book 4.5 stars. I didn't love it as much as The Will of the Many. I just think The Will of the Many is one of the best books I've ever read. But The Strength of the Few was so unique, so ambitious, and I still had a really good time, despite some of the difficulties I faced with kind of getting through the end. And I got that book from Russian Hill Books in San Francisco. The second book I read in January was The Safekeep by Yael van der Woodsen. Beautiful name, by the way, and beautiful cover. I got this from the library, so I don't have a physical copy. But before I even get into the details of the book, this is a new favorite. And this is a book that I've been telling everybody about. I currently gave my library book to a friend to have them read it before I have to return it. Because it's just so good and I want to talk to everybody about it. Essentially, the premise of the book is this girl in the Netherlands. She lives in this old house that her mother had, kind of her family home. Her mother died in this house. And now she lives in it alone, and her whole life is basically insulated to taking care of this home. She doesn't work. She doesn't really leave the home except to run errands. And this house is her whole life. And the book opens up with the girlfriend of her kind of player brother, them meeting each other. And then the girlfriend ended up staying over at the home for a couple of weeks while the main character, Isabel's brother, is traveling. Girlfriend, Ava. Initially, Isabel and Ava, or at least Isabel, really hates Ava and hates having people in her home and having kind of a lack of control over the space and its jurisdiction. And we see how their relationship progresses overall and kind of what their relationships to the homes really look like in terms of historical context and familial context. This book kind of starts out reading like a thriller, which for literary fiction I was very intrigued by and got me hooked immediately. I don't really love thrillers or mysteries, but I was very intrigued by kind of the historical setting. It's set in post-World War II Netherlands with, kind of fraught dynamics with people recovering after the war. And not much is said on that until, the events later on. It's one of those books where kind of the meaning is written between the lines. The writing is so gorgeous, but it's not telling you what's happening. You kind of have to figure it out. You put the pieces together. It's so satisfying. And and the historical context adds so much to what's happening. And it's actually an essential part of the book, which makes historical fiction just my favorite genre. There's also a lot of sex in this book, and the sex scenes are so like hot and sexy, but also so technical. I've never read like sex scenes written in this way where the descriptions are so like clear cut on what is happening and it's so like clearly visual, but also like it's so fun. And the sex scenes are definitely written like with the characters' personalities and desires and like repression written at the forefront. So that is really fun to read. Also, the author is, you can kind of tell by her name, Yael, which my friend told me is an Israeli name, and van der Woodsen, which is clearly Dutch. You could tell that she kind of comes from this multicultural background, and both those Dutch and Jewish aspects are weaved into the story so well and are just so core to it. And I thought that was really cool. It's especially interesting to me that this book was written in English, given that, you know, the author herself is Dutch and it's set in the Netherlands. But I read this book as part of like Jack Edwards' Inklings book club pick, and he interviewed the author, and she apparently wrote it. She grew up speaking English. That's how she grew up kind of writing, and she made the decision to write the book for that reason in English as well. You can tell there's so much kind of thought put into how like Dutch people talk and kind of what their values are in terms of the dialogue and the descriptions. I know that's a overarching takeaway there, and I can't speak for like an entire, like the culture of an entire country, but I thought there was a lot of care put into that, and that's, this is one of my new favorite books. I want everyone in my life to read it, talk about it with more people, and just, the yearning, the repression, just the historical backdrop, it's so good. So needless to say, the Safekeep got 5 stars from byeee, and it's one I won't be stopping talking about for a long time to come, and I got it from San Francisco Public Library. I read so many good books this year so far. I've read so many good books this month. And then the next book I read is Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead by Emily Austen. Emily Austen has a new book coming out. Actually, I think it already did on the 13th. And I really want to read that one because the premise is so up my alley. It's about like kind of, I think, a librarian who goes through mental health struggles, has to take a leave of absence, and it deals with her coming back to that and dealing with like the stress of book bans in the United States and kind of mental health, political backdrop. Anyway, so I really want to read that book, and I owned Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead and had heard great things about it in terms of its discussion of mental health through fiction. One thing I'll say, this is a bit of a tangent, but Matt Haig's books on mental health are like really popular. And I read The Midnight Library and hated it. Didn't hate it as much when I was reading it. Like, it was a fine read. But the more I think about it after having read it, the more angry I am at the oversimplification of depression. I could talk about that book for so long, but that's not really the point of this video. I just hate that book. And this book does everything I think that book did wrong well. It follows this young adult kind of figuring out her life named Gilda. First of all, terrible name. My like one qualm with this book is that the main character's name is Gilda. But anyway, she's struggling with keeping a minimum wage job. She is grappling with, suicidal ideation and suicidal thoughts. And she sees a flyer just kind of out in the street for therapy sessions through church. And she's like, why the hell not? Nothing else has worked. I might as well go to this. And she shows up at the church, follows the directions on the flyer, and is accidentally mistaken for a candidate for the receptionist at the church. And given kind of like her low self-esteem and just kind of her meek nature at this time in her life and her anxiety, she doesn't refute that assumption and just goes into the interview and gets that job. So the book is so funny. It seems like it would be kind of far-fetched, but somehow feels so like rooted in humanity and so real. And the book is kind of written very straightforward, very readable, and it's kind of written just like this happened, this happened, this happened, but very much kind of you seeing how the main character Gilda is feeling, mainly rooted in, her anxiety, her spiraling thoughts, her dark humor that is based in her depression. And it's just so poignant. It really reminds you of it really makes you think about the humanity behind people you meet in your everyday life. And there's so many simple but beautiful lines. Also, the way that Austen writes about just mundane, banal things in her surroundings are so fun. Snow is plummeting down from the clouds and coating everything. All the garbage and dog shit on the road is being tucked under a glittery white blanket. Like, just describing garbage and dog shit, specifically being covered in glittery white blanket of snow, like, it's just so funny. And it's just so fun to read. You can see that I dog-eared a lot, underlined a lot of phrases, and this is also one that I would feel like I would give to friends, not when they're like in the middle of health crisis, but maybe coming out of a depressive episode, or, you know, just feeling a little bit skeptical about life. So I gave that book 4 stars. It wasn't anything that kind of like blew my mind, especially by the end. I think things were tied up a little bit too well, considering the realities of life and humankind. But I do think it's just a gem of a book and so enjoyable, but also like really poignant and heart-wrenching. So I got this book from Noe Valley Books, and I'm very glad I own it because I will also be having people borrow this. And then the last book that I read in January was The Other Side of Change, Who We Become When Life Makes Other Plans by Maya Shankar. I mentioned this in my highly anticipated Reads of 2026 video, but Maya Shankar, she is well known for her podcast, A Slight Change of Plans, and she came to talk at my like workplace and event. I actually thought it was kind of funny because at the start of the event, like the facilitator, who's an employee of my company, was being like, "Thank you so much, Maya, for coming and like doing this for free," which I think is so funny because my company is huge. Like there were 100 people on that call, so it's not really for free. She's getting book sales. But anyway, it was a pretty interesting talk, and it convinced me to get this book. I'm kind of in a period not of like active change, but kind of anticipatory change, trying to make some big moves in my life. And so I've been thinking a lot about what my life might look like forward. And I tend to have a lot of anxiety, not with change in the like present, but in the future. So I thought this book would be pretty comforting. And it was, not necessarily because the advice was super applicable for me or really that like life-changing or novel, but each chapter of the book is rooted in one person's story grappling with very intense change. And we're thinking like life-altering health crises, and like complete career pivots, like really intense stuff. And each is basically the author telling this person's story and the author's experiences with this person through their conversations. And then also sprinklings of like psychological terms that relate to it and advice kind of based on that. I didn't think any of the psychology that I learned was really all that new to me, and none of the advice was really that crazy, but I really thought the stories were weighed out well, with lots of empathy and nuance and just really great storytelling at the core of it. So I think this book will be very reassuring in the periods of my life where I am experiencing a lot of change, and that's making me rethink kind of who I am and what my life is going to look at. But I think in the moment, it was nice to read, and a very quick read. I think I read it over like 2 days, but it wasn't all that crazy. So, but I will say there is an appendix in this book that is really just like a guide to each chapter and like what the science says, what you can do. And so that's kind of nice. I think I can find myself referencing this in the future. Yeah, so I got The Other Side of Change from Telegraph Hill Books, and I give it 3 stars. It was good. I'm not sure it was life-changing at this point in my life, but I think depending on what you're going through, it could hit really hard and could be very helpful. So yeah, I'm really happy with what I read this month. I feel like after resetting at the end of the year, I have like renewed interest in so many different topics, and I'm just really loving reading right now, and the year started off really well for that. So if in 2026 you're interested in reading recaps from someone who reads a variety of fiction and nonfiction and genres and subgenres, as well as does like different challenges, specifically like literary challenges based in San Francisco, please do give me a follow. Please subscribe. Yeah, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe on this video. And I hope you're doing well, and I'll see you in the future. Bye.